Okay, I hope everyone is in from the waiting room, and welcome, very welcome to this launch of socially distant activism. My name is Ruth Lister. I'm a member of the House of Lords and an emeritus professor at Loughborough University, and I've written about poverty. And it has been an absolute privilege to be asked to chair this launch. I think it's an important milestone in, I'm not sure this is a very good term, but what we might call poverty publishing, in terms of giving a platform to the knowledge that derives from lived experience. And in doing so, it's laying claim to the voice space that it's so easy for those of us who are more privileged to take up. And it's described in the introduction as a co-produced critical reflection, collaboratively, terrible word to say, collaboratively written between academics and anti-poverty activists. And as such, I think it's an important contribution to what has been termed a new form of poverty knowledge, as called for by the American scholar Alice O'Connor. That is, it's a form of poverty knowledge that's in the tradition forged by ATD Fourth World, which merges the knowledge derived from academic work, poverty activists, and most importantly, from the lived experience of poverty itself, which has not in the past typically been recognised as knowledge at all. But it is now in some quarters, and it is at least receiving the recognition and respect due to the expertise that is derived from experience. Now, lived experience has become something of what the authors call a policy and funder buzzword, to which lip service is all too often paid. And I've countless times now, I've read or heard ministers in the Lords or the Commons sprinkling lived experience in their speeches, like sort of confetti or stardust, as if somehow that shows that they care about it. But how often do they actually listen and take on board what has been said as derived from lived experience? And as the authors of this book, and I'm sure we're going to hear further today, voice is about being heard, not just being able to speak. And the book engages critically with the notion of lived experience and emphasizes the diversity of that experience among those living in poverty. And it has important things to say about the experience of the pandemic, and in particular, the impact of the digital divide, including its impact on activism itself. And it talks about the work that's gone into building the Apple Collective, working through differences and taking time to build social and working relationships. And I think that's very important, that we don't just take for granted that people can come together and work easily together. And I love the way that poetry is threaded through it, because it's such a powerful means of expression. Now we're going to hear from members of the Apple Collective, starting with Katie Goldstraw, who will introduce the book, and then we'll have 5 minutes each for other members to talk about individual chapters. And I'll just tell you who they are now, because they're going to run on each from each other. And I've asked them to be very disciplined in terms of not going over their 5 minutes. So to say, start with Katie, then Tracy Harrington, who is the project manager for Thrive Teesside. Then Diana Skelton and Tom Croft, who are part of the ATD Fourth World National Coordinating Team. Then Darren Morinus, who is Chief Executive at Expert Citizens UK, and Nicola Grattan, who is the lead for civic engagement and evaluation in the Department of Research, Innovation and Impact Services at Staffordshire University. Then Talia Drayak, who is an ATD Fourth World activist and who has been a key in editing the work. Now, just to say that hopefully there'll be 25 minutes for Q&A at the end. Please could you put any questions in the Q&A, which I'm sure everyone now is familiar with Zoom, but for anyone who isn't familiar with Zoom, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a Q&A icon. So put questions in that. Keep the chat for chat. It'll partly be used for technical and practical things, but if you want to kind of chat about what's being said, then please put it in that, not in the Q&A. Okay, so I think that is all I have to say by way of introduction, and I'm very happy to hand over to Katie.
Thank you. So this book is about being heard whilst being locked down. Apple Collective's new book details our participatory activism during the last year of COVID-19 lockdowns, demanding a voice and questioning what it means to be heard. Addressing poverty with lived experience. Well, what does this mean in a pandemic? As the first lockdown was announced in March 2020, and the UK government began daily policy announcements based on the knowledge that existed within the Westminster bubble on that day, in that moment, there emerged an almost exclusively digital response to the pandemic. Apple Collective members familiar with community face-to-face meetings and conversations over participatory activities were immediately pushed online. It was obvious that within the Apple Collective, some were more digitally connected than others. Some of our Apple members owned laptops and had access to broadband packages. Others were trying to join meetings on their phone with limited functionality and using much of their data package in the process. Other Apple members didn't have any digital technology at all because people hadn't needed it before now. The digital divide became a campaign focus for Apple. Apple members are led by lived experience of poverty, and it became immediately obvious that for those living on a low income, the digital divide was complex and reflected the intersectionalities of inequality that already exist and exacerbated and created new inequalities. Apple Collective members from RAPAR found that as asylum seekers, they were using over half their weekly allowance simply communicating with legal representatives. Apple Collective members from Poverty Truth community were facing financial premiums as a result of needing to get online to homeschool children, but not having access to credit, so were forced to purchase digital devices from less reputable sellers. Some Apple Collective members from Thrive Teesside had no access to digital devices at all and were unable to get public health information or basic supplies as they were fearful of leaving the house. These examples of digital exclusion are the foundation of something broader. For to be digitally excluded is to be silenced. If you've used all your data accessing websites to homeschool your daughter, if you've used all your weekly allowance speaking to your solicitor to progress your asylum case, then you don't have any data left to engage in activism. In a locked down world, those who are digitally excluded are silenced. Apple Collective began socially distanced activism, online and when restrictions permitted, in person, campaigning to have our voices heard. This book details our socially distanced activism, our participatory approaches to building voice, and critically discusses the meaning of the term lived experience in a pandemic setting. Having voices heard is not just about speaking, but it's about being listened to. Being listened to as we discuss this book, it's about going beyond storytelling. It's about being involved in analysing our stories and seeking epistemic justice, working in partnership with those who have influence to seek solutions. Our book is collaboratively authored and edited with people who have lived experience of poverty. The book critically discusses the meaning of the term lived experience, a term that sometimes is used tokenistically to meet a funder's tick box. For the Apple Collective, the term lived experience is about an ethical commitment to valuing the expertise gained from living on a low income. It's about a philosophical commitment to the equality of experiential knowledge alongside practitioner and academic knowledge sets. This book details the journey that Apple Collective have taken through the pandemic to campaign against the digital divide and to address digital exclusion using participatory approaches within the collective. Thrive Teesside write about thriving women, discussing through poetry the experience of women living on a low income and the effect that the pandemic has had on gender roles. ATD Fourth World write about their work globally to address the digital divide, discussing the importance of lived experience in addressing epistemic injustice. Expert Citizens write about how what began as a community research project became about community and about building relationships as the pandemic hit. Keep Talking Hardship developed creative communication approaches that reflected locked down lives in the local area of Stoke-on-Trent. The book concludes with a formula for activism that's based upon 3 principles for change: taking voice seriously, for change making as an epistemic necessity and as a collective action. My colleague Talia will discuss these in more detail as she draws the themes from the book together towards the end of this launch. For now, before I hand over to author of our chapter on thriving women, Tracy Harrington, I'd like to thank our funder, Joseph Rowntree Foundation, for their financial and practical support of Apple's work. So I'll let Tracy take on board the next chapter, the next discussion of the chapter on thriving women. Thank you.
Thanks, Kaylee. I'll do my best to stay on track and stay at the 5 minutes, all right? Thrive, well, I'm Tracy Harrington. I'm from Thrive and we're based in Stockton. We're a very small charity, grassroots, led by lived experience. Our mission, our organisation or charity's mission is to reduce inequalities in the local area and work with the people in our community to enact long-term sustainable change. We take a multidisciplinary approach. We tackle local inequalities by carrying out and advocating for collaborative, co-produced research. We do offer some support and we provide opportunities for local activism. This local activism, though, doesn't work on its own. It works in partnership with local people and institutions. And obviously for that, we need to develop relationships and merge areas of expertise. So we were keen to contribute to this collective piece of work, socially distanced activism. And we felt that a reflective piece around our project, Thriving Women, was key to be a contributing chapter within this book. I must also acknowledge that Thriving Women was also a collaborative piece of work with Tees Women's Ports as well, so I'd like to thank them while I'm here today. So the Thriving Women was hoped to shed light on the issues faced by women living in a deprived post-industrial society. We've got widening gaps of inequality, poor life chances and rising child poverty, and that generally forms the narrative of articles that are generally associated with Teesside. The collective piece, The Spirit of Teesside, thoughtfully brings together the contributions and the people's perceptions of the area that they actually live in. So I'm going to read you a part of that now. So this is a collective piece from people who contributed to our book. It's a parade of ghosts of the past. Over an uncertain future, shadows cast. They reach into every corner, banishing light, turning the high streets into endless night. The former workers look towards tomorrow with fear, sadly saying, I actually used to work here. What does the future have in store for our children? A changing community steeped in history. Teesside is a place for me, but it's not a place for everyone. It is sturdy, it is industrial, it is fragile, and it is changing. And that's part of the spirit of Teesside. So as I mentioned earlier, Thrive also engage in some activism, and that activism can actually take many forms. We can speak out, we can lobby, we can boycott, we can demonstrate. The Thriving Women, however, chose the power of words, reflection and insight. The contributions within this book are a collection of unique insights that reflect the lived experience of women who live in Teesside. And women who live in Teesside as well are a diverse group, but they've got a lot of commonalities. Throughout the pandemic, Thriving Women talked about homeschooling, its limitations, the inability to afford data, having no equipment, and little confidence to navigate their children through online worksheets. We also talked about the entrenched gender roles. The pandemic only exacerbated this. These are already there and entrenched within our society. And in order to effectively address the issues of area, I'll start again. In order to effectively address the issues that are concern in Teesside, It is imperative to involve and work with expertise, this expertise that comes with lived experience. If you deny the voice of lived experience and you don't allow a full range of expertise, there would be a missed opportunity to fully develop transformative policies that can really affect change. Policy and decision makers all too often have little or no comprehension of the precarious nature of living in a post-industrial community and or of being a woman who lives in that area. We do feel left behind. We've talked about how they feel their voice has in many times been ignored and silenced. One lady talked about, I hope that society wakes up. I hope they fight. I'm always forgotten because I'm a girl, because I'm from here. We're the oldest town around here, but we still get very little funds. Our town centre hasn't been updated since 1970. We're just left to carry on, and carry on we will. So paying tribute to the knowledge and skills of women from Teesside, Thriving Women continually reflected upon the contributions and the personal experiences felt by women. There was a conflict between adhering to a traditional role ascribed either to themselves from an external source or from an internal source. Their inner conflict proved quite pertinent throughout the book. And one of our contributors, and I'll just read an excerpt of this, and she talked about rules. She said, I heard you wrote the rules about who we should see and who we should speak to and how we should think. How our integrity should be measured by the length of our skirt or the strength of our drink. The rules you made were made for you. They were never meant for me. I think this is truly inspirational and insightful, and it really does lend itself to a positive debate about coming out of a pandemic. Thriving Women was a medium whereby women were able to articulate their thoughts, opinions and ideas. They were able to openly talk about their hopes for the future and convey messages of insight and wisdom. Not wanting to be seen as part of the problem, Thriving Women contributors hope that this insight is debated, acted upon and used for a vehicle for change. And I'll just conclude with one final poem. I mean, I could have talked about lots of poems and I had to be a bit selective in my 5 minutes. So this final poem is, I hope I make a difference in this world to help the children of future succeed. I hope they do not know the feeling of hunger, damp and suffering. I hope their parents shall not have to make a choice between food in the fridge or the heating on. I hope that people stop dying due to government's poor decisions. I hope that society wakes up. I hope they fight for the well-being of our country and our people, I hope. So that's my little 5 minutes today. I hope you do get the book and read the full chapter. And I'm going to introduce Diana and Tom from ATD Fourth World.
Thank you, Tracy. So the chapter that ATD Fourth World put together is called Global Activism, Overcoming Epistemic Injustice. ATD Fourth World is a community of activists who are spread across 34 countries on 5 continents. Throughout the pandemic, we continued communicating with one another to offer peer support and encouragement. Our solidarity became even more close-knit than before, but the challenges that we were facing led us to develop new approaches. Everywhere, we saw people who were already struggling with poverty who were bearing the brunt of the pandemic. For example, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, communities on remote mountaintops are particularly inaccessible during the rainy season. So it had to be a real priority for ATD activists there to brave the mud and in order to deliver soap and also information about COVID-19. At the same time, they were connecting the children on the mountaintop to an international creative project. One of these activists said, we're not just giving information about the virus, we're also strengthening bonds with parents and children because we feel like part of the same family. In the United States, Northwest New Mexico is a place where since 2011, ATD has been running an arts education project called A Story Garden. The goal is to support the learning and creativity of children from different Native American communities whose access to educational opportunities is very severely limited. When the pandemic caused schools to shift to remote teaching, This left most children in these communities struggling even more because of their lack of reliable internet access. So ATD facilitators put the Story Garden on wheels, and it began traveling throughout the rural communities to run regular after-school activities. Esther is a woman whose grandchildren take part in the Story Garden, and she's part of the effort to make sure that people get reached. Together with others from ATD, she volunteers to help pack boxes of food and other essential supplies like masks, hand sanitizer, and bleach. She's taken a lead on designating boxes to be for specific families who she knows might not get reached otherwise. She also has a strong conviction that doing this brings her closer to people who feel alone and desperate. She says, teaching my grandchildren to volunteer is very important to me. They ask, why do you do it when you're not getting paid? I tell them, she says, it's for the joy of helping. Esther's commitment inspires other people to join in to reinforce this web of solidarity that already exists. I am now passing over to Tom.
Hi, everybody. So yeah, I'm going to speak about the next part of our chapter, which looked at how the pandemic has affected the right to family life here in the UK. In the UK, families in persistent poverty are really disproportionately affected by child protection interventions. And these interventions are often experienced by parents and children as hostile. They can also very often lead to forced separations of children from their parents. And so this was an area of great concern for us prior to the pandemic, but during the pandemic, things got even worse. And one of the reasons for this was the fact that most family court hearings had to be held remotely, with all the technical challenges and all the impact on person-to-person sort of legal representation and support and advocacy that would normally be part of our effort to support people through these processes. All of that came under enormous strain, and it had a massive impact on standards of justice. ATD is part of a network called Parents, Families and Allies Network, PFAN, which was founded in 2020. This is a network that's led by parents with lived experience of social service interventions, who also provide peer support and parent-to-parent advocacy to those experiencing similar situations. So last autumn, PFAN carried out research with parents to understand their experience of remote court hearings during the pandemic. Talia Drayek, who you'll hear from later, she's also a member of PFAN, and she's one of the parent activists in PFAN who helped to run this study. She explains, Talia, in our chapter, how we wanted to gather the stories, to gather parents' stories to find a better way forward, their stories of remote hearings, and to do and to really stress a do no harm approach to the research. Our goal was for them not to feel discarded, used or abandoned. And after finalizing the research, we continued offering support through individual phone calls and emails, and other means of trying to bring together people online. We're still in touch with many parents who requested to stay in link because it's given them hope, really, during what has been a very difficult time for many, with the loss of human contact resulting from services moving online. Many parents have felt traumatized or even less supported and less able to understand decisions that are being made about them and their families. One mother told us, it's injustice that drives me in my activism. This is what motivates many PFAN and ATD parents who despite their activism having repercussions on their personal and work lives, they feel it's their duty to fill the support gap that exists, and many of them are making themselves available 24/7 to support others. in these projects that we've described in our chapter, and other projects that ATD Fourth World carries out around the world with people experiencing poverty, often leading the way, we're wishing to promote epistemic justice, and to do that by really taking care to put in place conditions that really allow co-production of a knowledge which can be emancipatory, a knowledge which can lead to action. The founder of ATD Fourth World, Joseph Rosinski, believed that an intrinsic part of valuing another human being is to recognize them as a thinking person with the capacity to hold and share knowledge and to offer insight into the human condition. Denying someone their voice or denying them the resources to build and share their thinking with others amounts to epistemic injustice. And this is something that can do real psychological harm to the knower whose knowledge is denied. And as well, it results in the loss of precious insights from direct experience. Rosinski identified 3 types of knowledge about poverty: knowledge from first-hand lived experience, knowledge from activism and practice, and knowledge that's more academic in nature. And what he insisted was that all 3 forms of knowledge be given equal weight in the co-production of knowledge to take action and to change things. In this form of participatory action research, all stakeholders are involved on an equal footing at all stages of the research process. The goal of the research can't be extractive and theoretical. It has to have as its goal to affect social change. And this is why ATD cultivates the conditions for people in poverty to really be equal partners in working towards social justice and developing collective wisdom. Thank you very much. And I'm going to pass on, I think, now to Darren from Expert Citizens and Nicola from Staffordshire University. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Diane. Yeah, so I'm Darren Marinas. I'm Chief Executive of Expert Citizens and a trustee for Lankelly Chase Foundation. What Expert Citizens is, we are a community interest company run by and for people with lived experience of multiple social disadvantages and quite often social injustices. People who experience homelessness, mental ill health, addiction, substance misuse, caught up within the criminal justice system, and survivors of domestic abuse and violence, and people experiencing hardship and poverty. We use our unique skills and knowledge and insights to try and change systems, to make services and organizations better for people who are experiencing some of the most difficult times of our lives. And we also do lots of research, peer-led research, putting people with lived experience in the real lead on where that research is going as well. We also help policymakers and feed into government for policy changes as well, and do lots of work around co-creation and co-production, ensuring that people who really have that knowledge are really listened to actively, and decisions positively made on their input. We believe we're at a unique time in life itself. You know, the pandemic has affected quite a lot of us in different ways, but we see this at Expert Citizens. People who've been on the brink of many things in their life, are very much survivors, actually see opportunities, and we have seen many opportunities. And the way we're able to develop and be able to sort of move and really work on them opportunities is actually incredible. And we're also seeing shifts in time. Very often when you know, we're invited along to get involved in academic research or policy changes or you know, strategies, very often we're just put in the acknowledgements list, and often very much at the end of that list of others. But today, you're witnessing something different. You are witnessing actually people being co-authors with academics, which in itself is a massive, massive systems change. Our sort of the bit we were writing about and well, co-written, this is quite a thingy that actually I can't put pen to paper. So myself and my colleague Nick who supported us in writing this chapter, and we really wanted to focus on the importance of community, the importance of different communities coming together, and what can be achieved by the communities coming together, and actually the creativity, the resilience, the knowledge, and what can be shared and what can be done and what can be achieved has been incredible to see. And I'm going to pass on to my colleague Nick, who'll talk a little bit more from the university side of our project and our chapter in this book. But thanks for listening. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Darren. I'll be very quick. As Darren mentioned, we were lucky enough to work with expert citizens on a project called Keep Talking, which was funded through UKRI, Enhancing Partnerships for Place-Based Engagement Fund back in 2020. And we were 2 or 3 months into the project when lockdown happened. It was based on a participatory action research project, and it was very much about how do we develop sustainable community research teams to help make a real difference to the place in which we're based. And the work with expert citizens, actually, we worked with the team there and also a previous team of community researchers where we previously looked into hardship as a group across the city. And we had huge challenges when lockdown hit, because obviously, you know, I think what that did, and when we go online, it just shone a spotlight on the inequalities within the group. You know, we'd got some people who were very used to using Zoom and Teams, and that was part of their everyday. We had people who were dialing in on a phone, and their kind of anxiety around that was palpable. And I think there's a couple of real things that we learned out of that. For me, it's very much about remote, not online engagement. And so we had to think of quite creative ways of engaging that group. And we made sure our team was set up in the right way, that we'd got that very personal contact with individuals within the team that could encourage that creativity. We have a lovely poetry book that we can share, I'm sure, later on, and also a recipe book that emerged in homage to us very much missing sitting together and eating cake and drinking tea. And I think the other thing that Darren kind of alluded to there was relationships. And I think we talk a lot about researchers and participatory researchers having relationships with their community research teams, but actually what was really valuable for this project was the relationships and the friendships within that group, and that really did help us get through the pandemic. So I really appreciate you kind of coming along today and listening to us talk about our chapter and our book. And just to finish off this section, I'm going to pass over to Talia.
Thank you. Sorry. One of the greatest challenges in making change, in giving and receiving support, is accepting that there's something wrong. Nobody sees themselves as vulnerable. Nobody wants to admit they need help. And relationships are the critical key here. Empowerment is vital to remedy vulnerability and enable activism and independence. And to understand where people are struggling, to understand what is happening that's creating this struggle, and to begin to put together the tools to support change to overcome those struggles, requires that we get right up close, that we listen and learn and work with those who are being challenged. When the pandemic hit, we were suddenly pulled apart, held far away from each other in a most unprecedented way. It hardly needs explaining to explore how isolating it's been, as we all tried to navigate lockdown after lockdown, stuck in place to wherever the pandemic found us. In the work we do as parent advocates across national and international networks, and with ATD Fourth World, we've had so many of the tools that we use to support individuals taken away. Reaching out and hugging someone, squeezing a hand, meeting up in person to listen and smile or cry with them. And yet out of the most terrifying and limiting situations, we've seen a new and for some more inclusive way of reaching out. Across the gaps created by seas, by mountains, by stretches of rural lands, across the gaps created by disabilities and gender roles, across the gaps created by languages and dress codes. We've created support groups for Supporting individuals, research and development, we've held meetings to build and unite communities, and foundling organizations have been born, all online. We've zoomed into this digital world, opening a space to allow relationships to be made and to thrive. We've reinvented connection and behaviors that support connection, to come together, refusing to let a pandemic keep us apart. It's incredible, really. Yet, there's this gap, a huge gap, where anybody without technology and the infrastructure to freely access the internet has been shut out completely. Their life opportunities have been horrifically limited. To give a quick example of this, let's consider the United Kingdom, where we wrongly take for granted that everyone has access to the internet and the skills to navigate it and the tools to use it. In our support and research with children and families who have had children in care or on the fringes of the care system, we realized that the gaps for families were incredibly far-reaching. During the pandemic, many parents living apart from their children went months, some even a year, without any direct contact with their most precious and beloved person. For many parents, they've only been able to see or speak to their child by phone or computer, if they had a phone or computer and the financial stability to pay for it. Some parents lost all contact with their children due to poverty in a pandemic. Focus groups with parents who had experienced family court hearings during the first lockdown were harrowing, where their ability to participate in the decisions being made about their families were hugely limited and impacted in ways far beyond expectations. Meanwhile, families are judged as neglecting or even abusing their children for challenges that they have faced due to a lack of technology. If you can't get online to sign up for your social security benefits, you can't buy food or electric. If you don't have any way to access these fancy online classes or Joe Wick's activity groups for your children, instead of seeing injustice and inequality, this is judged as a risk or a harm. Silenced from the online world and silenced by courts and children's services out of the necessity of confidentiality, these families have readily grasped the extended hands of support every time we've reached out. They want more than anything to be included in the decisions being made about them and the systems that affect their lives. The way that we did this meant handing out internet vouchers, mobile phones, tablet computers. I sent out dozens, sometimes even going and standing outside windows and shouting across the distance. The most important thing was that we were there for these families and we listened. As we move forward, Freedom Day shifted even further out of reach. It is essential that we advocate for advocacy, that we become activists for activism. We must enable everyone in our communities and our countries to participate. Moving online has built bridges across some serious barriers to entry for many people. But now we must ensure that everybody is equally able to access the online world for themselves, for their families, and for our future. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all of you for such great introductions to the book, and most of you are disciplined in terms of time, and I'd just let you go over a bit, and but it was great. Thank you so much. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A, great questions, so I think I'll start with those, and actually there's a question that I've got that I may link in with the second one, but the first one is from Barry Knight. He says, have you managed to make any advances with those with formal power to do something about it? And then he says, I have experience of supporting the voices of children to write a manifesto to end poverty that was given lip service by politicians, but totally ignored. I suspect that kind of resonates, but who would like to respond on that question about your engagement with people in power? Anyone?
I'll say something on a local level if you want, just to start it off. On a local level, within Stockton, obviously the digital divide became a particular problem straight away. That's been highlighted here. In the past, we generally have generally not had the best productive relationship with the local authority and the local voluntary sector umbrella group, but we quickly rectified that and worked together. And obviously, the local authority has an ability to make decisions in that area. So from discussions, because initially everything was put out online, you know, if there was a service available, it went out on the website, it went out on Facebook and things like that. And so from them discussions, and then that insight was offered, changes were made. And then, you know, it could be as simple as a poster or a leaflet to the ward councillor in the area. And so I think on local levels, you can see good practice where you've influenced, decision makers. And I think it is about that developing the relationship. So there's one small example. How do on a higher level?
Well, I think it's really good, because it's so easy to get kind of depressed because it feels like no one's listening, and it is, local level is where one has to start, and I think it's great that you've had that impact at the local level. Does anyone want to talk about national level? Be it, I think everyone's actually based in England, as opposed to, might be a bit easier, I think, in Scotland, but or Wales.
On a national level, we have had conversations. We've been asked to present at APPGs. We've started a campaign at a national level by writing to Oliver Dowden at DCMS. We wrote to all 9 Metro mayors at the start of the pandemic. We've written out to 13 members of Parliament in Scotland, because we have a Poverty Truth community based in Scotland that are one of our members, as well as in England. If anybody here is from Wales, then we would love to welcome you if you're led by lived experience as a group. So we're making inroads at a national level, and what we're trying to do is work locally and then work out from locally at the same time as working nationally. So trying to get our voice heard across national levels, Metro mayors, members of Parliament, APPGs, as well as with local members of Parliament. We've had some interest from members of Parliament. We've also had some disappointments where we've expected kind of a meeting and a conversation, and that hasn't happened. So again, this is a challenge. Come and talk to us, work with us.
Well, as a co-chair now of the all-party parliamentary group APPG on poverty, although I think we're probably sort of tied up now until the summer recess, but I will perhaps suggest that we have a session on the book, because I think it would be a really good way of, I can't guarantee how many people will turn up from Parliament, because it so much depends on what else is happening, but I will certainly make a note to follow that up and see if we can do that. Now we have a question, and please, if people could put, I noticed there's a question in chat which I'll come to, but if people could put it in Q&A, that helps. Because how can we help to ensure that more communities, systems and decision-making structures have people with lived experience at the heart of their approach? And I wonder if also, in answering that, could also, I think in the book somewhere there is a sort of definition of lived experience and your understanding of lived experience. So it would be good perhaps if, before answering that, the question about how to involve and ensure that that decision-making structures have people with lived experience at the heart. If you could say a bit more about what is meant by lived experience in the book. And I think, Darren, you're well placed to do that.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. Yeah, so the definition we use within the book, and the definition we also use at Expert Citizens, and sort of a national definition, comes from a report which was done by my good friend Baldi Sadua from the Centre for Knowledge and Equity for 2017, the value of lived experience and social change. Now, there's quite a few different sort of definitions within that book, within that report, and it's well worth reading that report as well. But we're talking about people who have experience of, whom have an experience of a social issue or a combination of social issues that have direct personal effect on them. Or we're also talking about people with first-hand, past or present experience of social disadvantages or social injustices as well. And, we're talking about people who lived experience, who hold knowledge, insight, understanding, wisdom, and lots of stuff like that as well. And yeah, we do need to, the lived experience movement is growing. It's growing in the UK. There is, if you want, there is websites out there called the Lex Movement, run by and for people with lived experience. You can gain loads of information there. And we are sort of making inroads in influencing and changing systems as well. So we see different funding, for example, which is coming from the Ministry of Housing at the moment, called Changing Futures, where there's a massive lived experience element within that funding. And we've started seeing that filter through as well. With locally in Stoke, we've seen different services commissioned with lived experience elements and delivered by lived experience organisations, which is great to see. But there's much more work to do in the future, and we really need to build on these foundations which have been set by people who have been doing this work for a number of years and campaigning.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to come in at all on that question about how we put lived experience genuinely at the heart of structures, processes, and so forth?
Thanks, Ruth. I think I'm perhaps the least qualified person here to talk about this, but I think I completely agree with Darren. There's still a long way to go, but I do feel that actually quite often the work can speak for itself, and I know certainly that was the case with a couple of the projects that I've worked on recently, you know, including Keep Talking with Darren, and the kind of leading project to that, which was Get Talking Hardship. And it was the fact that actually we involved, we had 43 community researchers involved in that project, and I'd say probably 2/3 had experience of quite recent experience of hardship and poverty. And it was actually the process of involving that team in the research that really captured the imagination of other citizens within the city. And I think it's very much about you know, working with people with lived experience to really amplify those voices, and quite often that can grab a lot of attention, and that in itself actually has changed. The Hardship Commission, who originally commissioned that piece of work, changed their terms of reference as a result of that to actually include people with lived experience on their steering group, and over time I'm a member of that group, and actually over time I've seen it become much more of a kind of movement, much more about, right, let's bring people together to really create change around this issue, as opposed to you know, being which was perhaps much more high level conversations that were had before that. And so yeah, I think for me it's very much about doing the work and working through that work to amplify the voices of people involved, just showing that it works well, I guess. Sorry, Tracy.
Yeah, just add a couple of points on there. Obviously there is lots and lots of good practice out there, and I think without being too political or anything, there are good examples trying to come through, and I think that's where we need cross-party support, isn't it? Like from select committees and advisory committees, you know, when they're doing calls for evidence. And I think Housing First, there's the piece of work around there from one committee, you know, where they're calling upon, you know, a call for evidence and ensuring that lived experience is at the heart of it. And it's about demonstrating by doing then. So I think if you demonstrate by doing, and you see that the outcome and the value of involving lived experience, it's more likely to be replicated again. And I think the Social Security Advisory Group was looking for, you know, when looking at social security, you know, we need to involve people with lived experience of disability in social security system. And I know even in other fields like Trussell Trust now, we're trying to work in a participatory way. I think it's about combining that knowledge and expertise, showing the value of doing it, and then it's about a culture shift, isn't it? So it's not like, oh, shall we call upon lived experience, but it's a way of working.
We need to get policymakers. We need to get policymakers to dare to do participation.
Yeah, I think
sorry.
I just think I hadn't realised Talia was trying to get in.
That's okay. All I was going to say was that in order to include people with lived experience, I would suggest that a lot of the work that ATD does with supporting people with lived experience, inviting people with lived experience, following up and building the relationships with people with lived experience, that's what gets them in the door. And so it's great to have seats at the table. That's what everybody, you know, everybody wants to be able to participate. But being able to get those seats filled is, you guys are, ATD does a brilliant job of doing that by building relationships and then offering that support so that people are able to participate.
Thank you, Tom. Sorry, I cut you off. I didn't mean to.
Oh, I'm sorry, Talia, as well. I didn't realise. No, I was just, you know, what Talia just said is critical. But the seat at the table, it's like, what table are we talking about? I think we have to create new tables, because if it's just a sort of like, well, we'll need a lived experience input into how are we already making policy, how we're already doing things, I don't think it will have a strong enough impact, and it might become a tick box kind of exercise, you know. And so how do we create sort of really innovative new spaces where policymakers can dare to sit in a different kind of space and meet people in different kind of way, and where you can create that more of an equality between people, and see each other as equals in a process. That's to me, and I think it's a shame we haven't got anyone from Poverty Truth community with us. There may be in the audience, but I mean they've created a space like that. And it has had an impact, where you've got policymakers that embrace that challenge. So yeah, you know, we just got to keep on plugging away.
That's really, really important points that people have made, and I think it probably is easier at local level than it is at national level. But you know, perhaps we need to think about how. And that is perhaps something, if we do get a meeting with the APPG on poverty, that we could try and explore at that meeting, you know, what might be possible, and do perhaps something on an experimental basis, just to see how it goes, and then what we can learn from that. Got a question from John Diamond in the chat. He said, thank you so much, really so important what you're saying for all of us. And it's, how are you being supported to continue your work? Strengthen the stories and experiences you've brought together. So that's quite a good, you know, looking forward. Where do you go from here with it? And what support, if any, are you getting? And perhaps I should just, while I remember, just say here, thanks to Bristol University Press and Policy Press for their support for work that's gone into this launch, and for publishing it, because it's not a kind of usual sort of publication, and it's great that they've done it. Anyone want to come in on that? Katie?
To give you a very short answer, that we have funding, and we thanked our funder in the introduction, from Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Very practically, they offer us a lot of support and advice in terms of, we've done a Twitter takeover for the International Day of the Eradication of Poverty, that we campaign on every year. We've had advice from the marketing and campaigns department, and we've also had very practical funding support to continue our work, and that makes a huge difference, because that if there's a little bit of support kind of each year, we then know that we can gather as a collective. We're meeting next week at Frimhurst Family House in Surrey to do a bit of a hybrid, in person and on Zoom, gathering as a collective, and that helps us define our work in a participatory way, so that we can meet online, we can meet in person, and we can continue having these conversations. It does cost money, and it costs money to make sure people are digitally involved. So something we were particularly grateful for at the beginning of the pandemic was some money from Joseph Rowntree Foundation that we could use to buy either digital devices or data for our members, to ensure that actually we could continue to meet online. And the flexibility of that funding was vital. So to give you an example, we've got a member up in Teesside who has a physical computer, because that's what she likes in her house. We have members who are our refugee members who have laptops because they've moved several times throughout the pandemic. We've got members who have a data package that we're able to support, because actually they had the phone, they had the iPad, but they didn't have the data in order to participate. So actually strengthening our work is vital, and that Funder Plus relationship, or however you choose to phrase it, and we've called it Funder Plus in the book, is vitally important to continue our work and continuing our voice. I'll let somebody else add in if you want to.
Does anyone want to? Tracy?
I think You're quite right there, Katie. You know, thanks to, again, to Bristol University Press, you know, this is not an avenue we've ever pursued in the past, so this is an awesome opportunity, and yes, thanks to the funder. But I think it's relying on other relationships in the community as well to help us go forward. It is about our local media, it is about our local MPs, about other organisations, and I know we've got really good support from, like, say, Church Action on Poverty, just to name one, but there could be hundreds other I name. And I think it's about them developing relationships to enable us to amplify our voice as well and make them connections. I think then, and obviously then key relationships with MPs and decision makers. And I totally agree with Tom and others about whose table are we sitting at. But the way that it's set up at the moment is in a particular way. So then we have to develop the relationships in order to change that.
Anyone else want to come in on that? I'm conscious that we're nearly out of time. And I just wondered if anyone wants to kind of reflect on what's been said before we finish. Diana.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about Talia's words about the things that pull us apart and the things that bring us together. And one of the things that some of our members were saying in the chapter that we wrote about was how much of a difference it makes, even when things are really, really difficult, to feel that you've got a sense of belonging to a community where people are doing something meaningful together. And that's what we're all here for. And, you know, building these connections, even when it's got to be virtual, that's what keeps us going.
Any other points that anyone wants to make? I think that's a really important one. I mean, that kind of comes across, that sense that what you created together, I think is really, really important. And the work, I think it was Nicola who talked about that, actually I'm kind of confused now, perhaps it wasn't, I can't remember exactly who it was, but you talked about the how you built those relationships and how important they were. And it's very easy to forget the importance of friendships and how you build them and then build trust through that, because I think there must have been a lot of trust in terms of what you've all put into this project. I think if no one wants to, I'm conscious that if I start asking any more questions it will go over time, and I think, you know, some people have been on, I know have been on Zoom. I think it was Darren said he'd been in a 7-hour meeting or something on Zoom. So I don't know, you must be absolutely punch drunk by now. But I'm, as I say, it was a great privilege to be asked to chair this. I'm so pleased that I was able to, because there was a question mark over whether I'd be able to get away from Law's business in time, but I was. I've found it very inspiring listening to you all. Thank you all so much for your contributions. I hope that, I find it very strange not being able to see the audience at all, but I hope that you've found it helpful. I hope you'll get the book, although it has to, I mean, I must say, as a rather old-fashioned person, I like to have books in my hand, and I find it quite frustrating only being able to read things online. So I'm going to have to work out how I'm going to do that in terms of reading the whole thing. I've read bits of it, but I certainly want to read it all, because there's so much in there that I think we can all learn from. And as I said, I will see, you know, I'm not making promises because I don't run the APPG, but I will certainly report back to my co-chair and the Secretariat to see what might be possible perhaps in the autumn. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. Wish you all well, and I hope you, well, I trust that you will be working together further, and that look forward to what else comes out of the Apple Collective. So thank you very much.